How did this guy go from being the most hated character on Lost to one of the most beloved? Welcome to the Lost Explained episode guide, in which we are exploring and explaining Lost, episode by episode, mystery by mystery. Beware, full spoilers for the entire series lie ahead. This time we are breaking down the Sawyer-centric episode Confidence Man, in which the island's resident troublemaker is accused of essentially being the cause of all the problems, including sabotaging a mission to triangulate the French woman's distress call, beating up a fellow castaway who dared to root through his stash, and denying medicine to someone in desperate need of it. But is everything as it appears to be, or is this con man more than he seems? Well, Sayid finally gets to tie him to a tree and torture him to find out. Let's get into it. Why do people love Sawyer so much when he is so horrible and hateful in the front half of Season 1? He's bigoted, selfish, and sometimes wantonly cruel. Sure, for a while, audiences really hated him, but then they started to love to hate him, until finally they just loved him, and he very quickly became a fan favourite before Season 1 had even finished airing. So what gives? Well, a big part of this is that audiences really love a redemption arc. We've seen it many times before in films and television, with characters who start off as big villains, but slowly evolve into more tragic and even romantic figures. People like to see villains redeemed, and to see the good in them triumph. If bad people in fiction can be forgiven and get a second chance, then maybe we all can. Furthermore, the idea that a hated outcast can find acceptance as one of the group is also a very powerful notion, and Sawyer became a representative of that on Lost, which we would see repeated again later with a certain other, although his arc will retain much of the moral ambiguity to the end, a moral ambiguity that is slowly bled out of Sawyer in later seasons. A lot of this character's popularity comes down to the fact that audiences also love the charming rogue, the Han Solo archetype, who may present as a hardened, cynical tough guy, but is really an old-fashioned romantic beneath it all, disguising their emotions and vulnerability with bravado. The writers often made it clear that they wanted Sawyer to be seen as their Han Solo, especially seeing as he frequently uses Star Wars references to describe other characters. One of his best friends on the island eventually becomes Jin, and Jin famously struggles to communicate in English. Sawyer goes on to name him Chewie, as in Chewbacca, a character from Star Wars who also cannot be understood. However, Sawyer learns to absolutely read and understand Jin before the man's English improves, much like Han and Chewie. I also think the love for Sawyer is very much down to Josh Holloway's performance. A lot of actors would have played the man as a pure villain, someone to be afraid of. Anyone who has seen Matthew Fox's audition for the character will know exactly what I mean by this.
Who are you?
What?
I said, who are you? What's your name?
You know my name.
I know the name you told us.
Well, there you are!
I think you're...
Excuse me? Turn it off.
Holloway sneaks in a lot of knowing smiles early on, imbuing the part with a southern fried charm. He makes a rather bull-headed redneck character into someone who occasionally makes us smile too. The showrunners saw that glint in Holloway's eye in those early episodes, his playfulness, his flirtation, and they wrote towards bringing that out of him more. And Sawyer's humour really does shine through on many occasions, allowing us to see different shades of him. Sometimes he has insightful observations about the group dynamics or the individual. He is a master manipulator after all, and con men are often students of human behaviour.
You've been waiting for this, haven't you? I get to be a hero again, because that's what you do. Fix everything up all nice.
Other times he can even be just a little bit tender-hearted, and Confidence Man is the first episode to really show us the wounded little boy beneath all of the bravado. I believe it was this episode that turned the tide for the character in terms of how he was perceived by the audience. A bit of charm and a tragic backstory go a really long way. Sawyer episodes almost always revolve around cons or deceptions, whether in the flashback stories or in the on-island present, or sometimes both. Here we see how his regular everyday con works. Find a beautiful woman with connections to big money, seduce her, hook her into a scheme, and get her to convince the husband to hand over gobs of cash. Then do a runner. It's a very unsophisticated con, but it works for Sawyer. He can rely on his good looks and charm to do most of the work. We will see his old broken suitcase full of money trick play out a couple of more times in the show as well, each time with a very different outcome.
You weren't exactly supposed to see that.
Are you serious?
What? Put your damn clothes on, Jim. You got it, partner.
You're a cop.
Surprise.
Anyway, the flashbacks effectively establish Sawyer's grifting ways. He's living from con to con here. The man isn't a millionaire at this point because he keeps the stakes relatively small. This is the first episode in which a flashback did not directly involve how a person got onto the island, and demonstrated how some of the flashbacks would reach back further into a character's past to see the long roads that they travelled before arriving on the island. The on-island story sees Sawyer's hoarding of supplies finally come to bite him in the ass, as Jack and Sayid take it upon themselves to tie the man up and torture him as to the whereabouts of his stash. Shannon has a rather plot-convenient asthma attack in order to justify this rather severe solution to the dilemma, and believe it or not, upon first viewing it was actually really satisfying to watch Sayid interrogate and torture this guy, because despite those flourishes of charm, Josh Holloway had yet to find the soul of the character, because every episode prior to this was about making him an unlikable instigator. Confidence Man has clearly been intentionally designed to make us like the guy a lot more. Sawyer's tolerance for pain is impressive, almost admirable in fact. His stubbornness is plain to see, yet it somehow also gives us a grudging respect for the man. I mean, I would crack the moment I saw Sayid sharpening those bamboo shoots. This is another example of how Sawyer plays the role of the villain in order to be hated, because he feels like he deserves to be punished for all of the bad that he has done. He can't find and punish the real Sawyer, and he certainly recognises that in a twisted way, he has become the man he was chasing. Something that perhaps only first occurs to him in the flashback from this episode, when he sees the young boy in the middle of his scam. He is really seeing himself there, and this wounds him. He bails on the con and refocuses his mind to tracking down the real Sawyer, a mission that will lead him into killing an innocent man. However, on the island, he finds himself suddenly adrift, unable to do what he does best when trying to suppress his grief and guilt. So he starts leaning into his bad boy ways and making himself the target for all of the hatred and disgust of the surviving passengers. So when Jack and Sayid come calling, accusing him of denying Shannon a life-saving medicine, he plays up to the accusation and shines them on, in part because he doesn't like being challenged by these two men, and resents their self-appointed standing within the group hierarchy, but also because he knows that he is going to be punished for their suspicions, and considering the things that he has done, he knows that he had it coming. He might be innocent of this crime, but he isn't innocent of other crimes. Okay, so it is a little bit lame that the writers tried to turn this whole scenario into Sawyer conning a kiss out of Kate. It's very playground soap opera, but at the same time it is an incredible moment from the show. I don't care whether you are Team Jack or Team Sawyer, whether you hate Kate or think she's great. This kiss is one of the hottest on-screen kisses in the series. It's no surprise to me that people started shipping these two after this episode aired, and that the writers recognised how electric the on-screen chemistry was between Josh Holloway and Evangeline Lilly. These two share some of the best kisses in the whole show. They really go for it. And so the love triangle is born. The tomboy girl next door torn between the good doctor and the bad boy from the wrong side of the tracks. Classic formula. I know some people take issue with this love triangle, but I actually enjoyed it for the first couple of seasons because it introduced a dramatic, romantic element that the show really needed. The will they won't they formula is tried and tested and true. It's worth remembering that not everyone became invested in the show because they wanted to know what the island was. Some people watched it and were enthralled because they simply wanted to know who Kate was going to pick and end up with. That's another thing to love about Lost. It caters to all kinds of audiences in ways that other shows do not. The fandom is a broad church. When Kate reads the letter and deduces that it was written by a young Sawyer himself, it's the first real moment of true connection between them. She understands what it is like for a man to come into your life and destroy your family. In fact, that was the reason she ended up a fugitive in the first place. She finally accepts that she sees a kindred spirit in Sawyer. a criminal who was forged by circumstances, yet continued to commit crimes out of choice. He is a man with demons not too dissimilar to her own. They are both guilty in more ways than one. And this is the scene where she stops judging and othering Sawyer, and instead begins to feel for him. There are a few scenes in this episode that foreshadow things to come. Charlie and Hurley are still being paired together, although this time Hurley's weight becomes an issue for the first time when Charlie accuses him of hoarding food. It's a really awkward moment in which Hurley is offended at the implication, and we get the sense that his weight is going to be a recurring issue. However, in just one season's time, we will find out that Hurley isn't above hoarding food when he becomes the man in charge of the pantry in the hatch. Speaking of Charlie and food, there's a sweet moment between him and Claire that occurs towards the back end of the episode, in which Charlie conjures up some imaginary peanut butter for a very hungry Claire. It's one of the more memorable scenes between these two that represents the very best of their relationship and dynamic, and will be paid off quite nicely next season. Sun's elegant solution to the asthma dilemma by using eucalyptus plant leads her into becoming a pseudo-nurse who will later assist Jack during a medical emergency following Boone's accident. This dynamic sadly doesn't get tapped into much further after season 1, which I always thought was a shame as it gave Sun extra utility to the group, and she could have been brought in to help Jack out during other medical emergencies. It would have been cool to see her assisting in the tent during his appendectomy. Sun's horticultural knowledge is established and put to use here, and it's what leads to the creation of a garden at the edge of the jungle, where she will begin cultivating a variety of medicinal plants and vegetables. I think this episode is where that idea was born. I think Confidence Man is a real cracker of an episode, and the best since the two-punch brilliance of Walkabout and White Rabbit. The dramatic conflicts are well handled, and we really get to see how the different personalities are beginning to either mesh together or clash completely. It's within these self-contained storylines of the first season that the show really digs into what makes these people tick. When the non-mythology episodes are this engaging and well handled, I understand why so many people were sad to see such storylines eventually become more subservient to the overarching narrative pull of the mythology. Furthermore, Confidence Man progresses a lot of characters and relationships, and not just in terms of softening Sawyer's hard edges or Kate's affection for him. We see that Saeed has the capacity for committing horrific acts of violence, especially in the name of a cause that he believes in. It's also no small thing that the person he is running to the rescue of is the woman whom he will later fall in love with. We also get to see another side of Jack and how far his antagonism towards Sawyer can go. In this case, it's violence by proxy. But after this episode, the two men are always teetering on the brink of a full-on brawl, partially fueled by their romantic rivalry, but also in terms of how their respective philosophies and personalities clash. Jack is live together, die alone. Sawyer is every man for himself. But it will take 4 more seasons before their conflict really bubbles over and they come to blows again.
Who the hell you think you are?
For anyone wondering why I call the mysteries and answers section of these videos Jungle of Mystery, it's a direct lift from a line of dialogue in this very episode, when Sawyer says to Kate,
Baby, I'm tied to a tree in a jungle of mystery. I just got tortured by a damn spinal surgeon and a genuine Iraqi. Of course I'm serious.
I've always loved that line and how accurately Jungle of Mystery sums up all the Weird Island madness. Who was the real Sawyer? Well, the real Sawyer turns out to be none other than John Locke's dear old biological dad, Anthony Cooper. In his younger years, Cooper played the same scam that we see Sawyer running, baiting a beautiful woman, getting her to bring the husband to the table, then making off with all of their money. Only in this case, the collateral damage was unfathomable. Cooper is a man who spent his life destroying other people's, including both his own sons and a young James Ford, setting both men on a path of pain and suffering that would eventually lead them to the island, and ironically lead them back to the man who unintentionally set them on that path to begin with. Everything comes back around. Cooper is one of the most loathsome side villains of the series. He has almost no redeeming features, but we shall discuss him more when we get to Deus Ex Machina. He recurs throughout several more Locke episodes, becoming the linchpin of his backstory. The writer set up his connection to Sawyer in Season 1, and when looking back you can see that this was one of the clearly planned out parts of the show. You can confidently trace a line from Confidence Man all the way to Season 3 episode The Brig, where both Sawyer and Locke's backstories finally pay off simultaneously. It's one of the more elegantly plotted parts of the early seasons. Why was Shannon's asthma never mentioned again? Sun's herbal remedy with the eucalyptus plant proved to be very effective and was surely used for any future flare-ups that Shannon had, although we never see this happen on screen again. Her asthma is referenced a couple of more times in the show. In Exodus, we see Boone surprise Shannon with the inhaler on the plane, a moment that demonstrates how he was always there for her and had her back, rendered all the more tragic due to his recent demise on the show. Shannon's inhaler makes a comeback in Season 6 episode Lighthouse, in which Hurley points it out for anyone in the audience who may have long forgotten that a whole episode was once built around it.
What is that?
Asthma inhaler.
Dude, it's Shannon's.
I think the asthma was something the writers could only really make a storyline out of once. As soon as they wrote in the solution to the problem, it would have been difficult to bring the condition back and milk it for more drama. There are little issues like this that get thrown up throughout Season 1, mostly to give Jack a chance to perform his function as the resident doctor. Remember, this was still being written at a time when network TV formulas were all about consistency and repetition. Characters would be kept in a stasis where they would deal with a crisis every week that they could resolve, often using their particular skill set. Lost breaks away from this by Season 2, but you can still feel the old school way of writing a network TV show maintaining a stranglehold on Season 1. I was recently asked in the comments as to why the island didn't heal Shannon's asthma when it was healing all sorts of other ailments and injuries. My answer is that the island heals selectively. Sometimes it allows sickness, if that sickness leads to certain causality outcomes, such as Ben's spinal cancer or Jack's appendix rupture, and other times the conditions are more minor, such as Sawyer's hyperopia or Michael's food poisoning. There are some things that the human body has to work out for itself. So, people can get sick on the island under certain circumstances. That said, I personally always viewed Shannon's asthma attack in this episode as being semi-psychosomatic. Strong emotions such as anger, panic and stress can trigger these kinds of attacks, especially if an asthmatic worries that they don't have a working inhaler to hand. So Shannon is kind of having the equivalent of a panic attack in this scene. The psychological triggers the physical. But another way to look at it is in terms of causality. Shannon needed to have this attack because it leads Saeed to torturing Sawyer, which ultimately causes Saeed to exile himself from the camp. This leads him to Rousseau. Rousseau leads the oceanic survivors to the Black Rock. The dynamite from the Black Rock leads them to blowing open the hatch, and so on and so on. It's all part of a chain of events that would not happen if Shannon didn't give Saeed a reason to torture Sawyer. Confidence Man is the first episode of the show to truly demonstrate how even the meanest bad guys on this show will be allowed depth and complexity. Redemption is possible. You can make different choices here on the island than the choices you made back in the world. And while this particular tiger isn't quite ready to change his stripes just yet, we certainly see the beginning of that change taking place. Lost, in Season 1 in particular, prided itself on subverting what we the audience thought they knew about these people. The flashbacks brought context to their on-island behaviours so we could understand them more, and how their new circumstances allowed them the opportunity to change their ways. It's a very long journey for Sawyer, but he really was the first character to really embody this thematic idea that such transformation was indeed possible. Another thematic backbone that runs through Lost is about cons and con artistry, people being tricked or manipulated into doing things. Sawyer actually sums it up best later in Season 2 episode The Long Con, when he explains it to Cassidy.
It's called a long con.
Okay, a long con. How does it work?
It works by getting someone to ask you to do something like it's their idea. It's not their idea. It's your idea.
I wonder if this will become relevant again.
You're going to need to tell him that he has to bring everyone who left back to the island. And when he asks how to do that, You tell him he's going to have to die.
You're gonna have to die, John.
Anyway, Confidence Man introduces this concept which recurs over and over again throughout the narrative. Sure, it is mostly tied into Sawyer and Locke's backstories. Sawyer was a successful con artist, and Locke was a successful mark targeted by a con artist. And both men's lives have been irrevocably impacted by conman Anthony Cooper, the original Sawyer. But if we really dig into the ongoing plot of the show, particularly the storyline surrounding Locke, a lot of his on-island arc ends up being tied to the biggest con artist of all, the Man in Black, who is playing out the longest con ever devised, one that spans decades and involves many moving parts, all of which has been orchestrated to mythologise John Locke and create a legend and a prophecy that he will one day be the island's de facto leader, and that he will also have to sacrifice himself in order to save it. The writers were setting up this long con in some form very early on in Season 1, but we shall cover that when we get to Deus Ex Machina. Sawyer will eventually earn the title of the greatest liar I've ever met by the Man in Black.
Because you are the best liar I ever met.
Who himself is clearly one of the great deceivers and whose entire existence revolves around deception and manipulation, and he is even placing Sawyer above Benjamin Linus, which is really saying something. Or maybe that's because Ben lies so much that you can never fully trust anything he says, and people quickly learn to stop believing him.
Did you know about this place?
No. No, I didn't.
Is he telling the truth?
Probably not.
Whereas Sawyer can tell you a lie, and you believe it because he knows how to sell it. I always thought Ben's proclamation that the others were better at the con game than Sawyer was ultimately untrue and very overstated.
We did all this because the only way to gain a con man's respect is to con him. You're pretty good, Sawyer. We're a lot better.
You need to be able to gain someone's trust for a con to really work. All they ever did was threaten to kill Sawyer in order to get him to fall in line. Ugh, we'll cover that silly redundant plotline when we get to Season 3. What we come to learn is that Sawyer seldom ever lies just for the sake of it, or out of pure malice. When he uses his stock and trade on the island, it's always to get something, whether it be a passionate kiss, or control over a stockpile of guns, or to get food and shelter for his people at the barracks whilst lost in time, or to outplay another con man by zagging for a submarine instead of zigging for a plane. However, when that day comes, Sawyer will finally be outsmarted and outplayed, because he isn't the greatest liar or con man in this story. The Man in Black is. Although the real confidence man of this episode, in my opinion, is John Locke, who, as we find out later, is the real guilty culprit responsible for knocking out Saeed, who then deflects his guilt with a red herring and directs Saeed towards Sawyer.
And from what I've seen, you and Mr. Sawyer share a certain animosity.
No, he has an alibi. Just before I was struck, he set off a bottle rocket, a signal we'd worked out 2 kilometers away. He couldn't have had the time to go from...
Unless he found a way to time delay the fuse on his rocket.
It's an interesting scene when looking back, knowing the truth, because is Locke doing this to save himself and simply using the most easy to blame figure on the island as his cover story? Or is there more to it? Is he trying to force Saeed and Sawyer into a confrontation that might actually facilitate a change in Sawyer, in the same way he has helped Jack and Charlie through unconventional methods, and will later challenge other characters in very questionable ways, such as Boone? Locke knows that Sawyer is actually innocent for a change, so for him to be persecuted for a crime that he didn't actually commit might be the key to providing real change and growth. It certainly adds to the perfect storm of grievances against Sawyer that have already been brewing for some time. I'd also like to add that giving Saeed the knife is a real Man in Black move right there, and it speaks to Locke's reckless nature. Of course, Sawyer is his usual stubborn self, and he leans into the accusations and the hatred because that's what he wants in order to self-punish. However, if Locke did intend to push Sawyer into a corner in order to face himself, then it was a very risky, although ultimately quite effective manipulation, because by the end of Confidence Man, we do see Sawyer's guard finally drop for the first time to reveal the hurt little boy beneath it all. Here are some things worth noting about the episode. This is the second time in 2 episodes that we see a character getting instantly knocked out after being hit on the head. This is also the second episode in the first season to see a character tied up and imprisoned by the other castaways. We saw it happen to Jin previously in House of the Rising Sun, and poor Jin will get tied up a couple of more times too. And we will see it happen again in a slightly different context in the very next episode with Saeed and a French chick. Being held captive, hostage, or imprisoned is definitely a recurring trope in Lost. We see it a lot in Saeed-centric episodes. I mean, this guy gets tied up and does more tying up than people who are into bondage. Saeed be kinky, bro. We will see major movements of the narrative involve imprisonment, with the Henry Gale arc in Season 2 and the Hydra Island arc in Season 3 involving a love triangle and some cages. Anthony Cooper will spend his entire time on the island bound to chairs and posts, which is the very least he deserves. Ben will be imprisoned once again in Season 4 in his own basement, no less, plus a brief stint with Miles in a boathouse and a grenade in the mouth. Kate will find herself being detained and facing prison in her flash forwards. In fact, for a large majority of the show's run, she is actively trying to avoid capture and detainment. Saeed in Season 5 gets his obligatory episode revolving around someone being tied up and tortured. And of course Ben once again in Season 6 when he is made to dig his own grave. Plus Richard's backstory of being shackled inside the belly of a shipwreck. Moreover, the notion that the man in black is himself a prisoner of the island, shackled to the source and unable to escape. This theme of captivity, being held against one's will, speaks to how many characters view the island as a place that they are trapped by. Confidence Man gives us more daddy issues for the group therapy fire. This time it's Sawyer dealing with his father's murderous actions, which have cast a long shadow over his life. A shadow which threatens to consume him as he engages in incredibly self-destructive behaviour. He actually has more in common with Jack than you might think, and he instinctively senses that, and even noted as much to Kate in the previous episode. The episode ends with Saeed banishing himself from the group as self-punishment. He took things too far with Sawyer, allowing his own anger and hatred of the man to dull his sharp interrogator instincts. Saeed is usually very adept at spotting liars unless he is too emotionally involved. It's only then that his judgment can be affected, and this episode is very good at showcasing that side of him. A side that we will see return several more times before the series is over. What's interesting is that Saeed doesn't intend to ever return to the camp unless he finds a way off the island, which is a pretty severe way to serve penance, but I suspect that his decision making here is rooted in a deeper guilt about other people he has harmed that spans many, many years. The idea of banishing oneself from the group is something we see a few characters do. They usually just go into the jungle to be alone and crack open some mangoes, which we see Saeed do after Shannon's death, or they move down the beach to lick their wounds, like we see with Charlie. Sometimes self-banishment and divorcing from the group is viewed as a more righteous choice, at least when it comes to retirees Rose and Bernard. The Blind Boys of Alabama warble over the soundtrack for another one of those "let's see where everyone's at" montages that I've previously mentioned that I'm not a super massive fan of. I do tend to find most of these sequences quite cheesy, and this particular song, I Shall Not Walk Alone, is used in a way that is extremely on the nose. Look, we are watching a man walk off alone as a song tells us I shall not walk alone, and the song then tells us that we are a long, long way from home. Because, you know, these people have crashed on an island a long, long way from home. I mean, this is hardly the height of subtlety. But then again, the needle drops in Lost Season 1 are never particularly subtle. With that said, it's hard to deny just how great this song is, and it does fit the mood of the montage very well indeed. The Blind Boys are doing a lot of the heavy lifting here. Watching Sawyer consider burning his letter, yet being unable to bring himself to follow through on it, is a really great moment. It is here that the Sawyer we will come to know and love makes his first real appearance. While the lyrics of I Shall Not Walk Alone convey extremely obvious meaning when viewed in conjunction with these images, they actually resonate well beyond the events of this episode. Here are just some sample lines that are retroactively imbued with double meanings. Battered and torn, still I can see the light. And we shall be forever bound. Obviously this is simply a case of unintentional serendipity, but it just adds an extra thematic richness and depth to the show in retrospect. As for our number count, the only significant number from the Valenzetti sequence to come up is in relation to how old Sawyer was when his father killed his mother. He was 8 years old. The year was 1976, and little did young Sawyer know back then, but his older self from the future was currently coexisting in the same time period with him, only living on the island somewhere on the other side of the earth. I can only imagine how hard it was for older James to live through that day, knowing that the horrible event that shaped his life was unfolding, to know that he could have stopped it. However, Sawyer did not take action because he believes what's done is done. Whether you can change the past or not, it doesn't matter. What matters is who you are, and how you got there. In fact, it was John Locke, his fellow traveller, who taught him that lesson.
You want to go back there? Why would I want to do that? So you can tell yourself to do things different. Save yourself a world of pain.
No, I needed that pain. Get to where I am now.
Join me next time when I cover the Saeed-centric episode Solitary, which is a springboard for so many mysteries and a setup for so many plot points that it's going to be the equivalent of tucking into a juicy steak. Really hope you can join me for that one. Please like, share and subscribe to keep this channel alive. Consider donating to the Patreon if you would like to see me make more videos just like this one. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all back on the island.